That Podcast Network and the It's Me Speaking to You podcast presents a podcast series for the archives. I talk to the producer and director of the Tupac assassination series, as well as the latest groundbreaking docuseries, Tupac Cover-Up. RJ Bond comes and talks about his many years researching and reporting on this case. And we will go episode by episode, breaking it all down. It has been way too long, and there are still way too many unanswered questions. Buckle up. You do not want to miss this. And what is cracking, everybody? Happy New Year, everyone. Merry New Year out this son of a bitch. We are back in the saddle. RJ and I were just talking about it. It's been a little bit of a gap since we've last connected. A myriad of things have gone on to keep us from jumping into this episode here, but we are back. RJ's feeling better. I'm feeling better. You know, a little bit of sickness, a little bit of blown out knee, life stuff, the holidays. We are back, man, to drop the breakdown of episode 5, The New Bad Guy. And we left off at episode 4, Good Cop versus Bad Cop. Like I was just telling RJ, the hero of this case and the Biggie case is Russell Poole, and I hope we did him justice in that last conversation. Again, we need more Russells in the world, man. We need more Russells in the world. But here we are, episode 5, The New Bad Guy. RJ, how we doing, brother?
Doing good. I think the last everybody keeps wondering what happened to RJ. The live streams have been cut back huge. Because of course they always run to the boogeyman. RJ got sacked by the boogeyman. Blah blah blah. Now, the reality is that probably. I mean, we did the press screening in New York in the first week of November. So you kind of have to go back that far to remember when my life was sane in any way, shape, or form. Up until now, all of November and December was just a blur. And unfortunately, I got hit with the flu, which knocked me out for a while. It's funny. I just took a drive by that intersection, Koval and Flamingo. Last time I was in Vegas a few weeks ago, and the intersection is unrecognizable now completely. They've outfitted it for the Formula One racing. They've got bridges now, actually, that goes over Koval down Flamingo, where you actually take this big bridge now and go over it. And you wouldn't recognize it if you took a look at it. You wouldn't even recognize it. In fact, I was driving by it. I'm like, wait a minute, is this Flamingo and Koval? Yeah, it is. And just completely looks different now. You can jump on, I think Google Maps even has it now where, how tore up it is. But we'll see how long that lasts, that Formula One. But it was definitely a blur between the beginning of November and the end of the year here. And then, of course, on top of everything else, getting sick. That's never a fun thing. Wasn't anything bad. You just don't feel like talking, and Craig. You just don't feel like
no.
Bed,
So. Yeah, like I was telling RJ, I blew my knee out about a week or 2 weeks ago tomorrow, and it was. I mean, I'm not a sit down person at all, but I could have probably talked, but I was in just pain, so my mind was not into, going through all my notes and stuff. So I was quite distracted. But here we are, man, and absolutely kicking off the year of our Lord 2025, embracing every single blessing, man. So. I am so stoked to be back here with you, RJ, and we're about almost done, man. We're at episode 5. We got one more left after this.
And for again, this season, anyway.
For this season, without a doubt. And again, I can't thank you enough. My original proposition through my good friend John Aganopoulos. Shout out to you, the Greek. Happy New Year. He helped facilitate linking me up with RJ, and RJ was so cool. Like, hey, man, instead of just doing one episode, let's knock out a breakdown of every episode. And if I remember you correctly, you said you get a little bit more mileage out of this conversation. I absolutely agree. And again, I can't thank you enough. But here we go.
Sure. Let's start.
No,
let's start the new year with an announcement. I have been approached to do season 2 of Tupac Cover-Up.
Nice.
And we'll see where it goes. The first, it won't be as long. It won't be 6 episodes. It'll be 5 this time around. The shows have been written already. So we're just rounding up the interviews to get the story done. And there's a lot there. Really, there is. We really kind of did a big overview in the first season of the show of the kind of the whole story. And what we're doing now in the second season is we're going to really take a deep drill down to the root canal, if you will, of some of the rot that exists, and take a look at that and how that's going to affect the upcoming trial. The tentative release date, if we stick to it, the tentative release date will be March 5th, which is a week before trial. So, yeah, so it should be fun. We'll see. I have to give them a definitive yes or no whether or not I'm going to do it. I got to give them a definitive yes or no in the next week as to whether or not we're going to deliver.
So it sounds like, the production, the story arc, if you will, with the 5 episodes is going to be somewhat independent of the trial and the outcome of the trial.
Yeah, I mean I think that the unfortunate part about the way things are in the trial, because it's very fluid and there hasn't been a lot of information. There will be as it comes a little bit closer to time, but by that time we're going to kind of be locked. But
Right.
I think that the if I had to give a summary of the what what season two is going to be, is really it's kind of it's a travesty is what it is, because first season we just kind of said it shouldn't happen for all these good reasons, but unfortunately what we're going to be dealing with in season two is really more of the societal aspects of what's in the mechanics of the Keith Davis case. So for example, one of the episodes is going to be about Keith Davis. Who is this guy? He's being blamed for one of the biggest murders, arguably, in pop culture history. And we don't even know who this guy is. We know what he's written in some books, and people have taken that and run with it 5 ways till Sunday, but is it the truth? Who
Right.
is this guy? So, we're dealing with that, but the last episode, I think, that we're doing of the show is really going to focus on how there's such a systemic distrust for our legal system, and how a young black man, what motivated Keith Davis to give up the public defender that he had and go with a private attorney. That's a very costly endeavor. If you don't have the money, Keith Davis doesn't have the money. If you don't have that money, then it's a definite choice on what your strategy is going to be. Prosecution has an unlimited checkbook, Jeff.
Right.
They can write a check and spend all the money they want to. It's the public's money, and to get anybody, interview anybody, depose anybody, they can do that. They have an unlimited checkbook. Public defenders do too, and people don't understand that. They do too. But oftentimes, what will happen is, because there's this institutional distrust for public defenders, oh, they'll sell you out, oh, they won't ever do well by you. And I'd rather go with a private attorney. And you come to find out that all those things the public defender could have done and would have cost you nothing. Now your private attorney is saying, well, to depose this guy, it's going to be
Right.
$2,500, $10,000 for this. We need to go get this guy interviewed. That's going to cost 10 grand. And you don't have that money. And the attorneys usually aren't really good about advancing that money because they know it's the money they'll never get back. So we're really going to take a look at that. We've got some exciting interviews coming up with some sociologists. I think we're getting somebody very, very high up within the city of Los Angeles that'll be doing an interview with us,
Interesting.
talking about how do you gain back the trust of the public through your institutions. And I think that we kind of have to brace ourselves for the fact that there's a real possibility that Dwayne Keith Davis might go to prison.
Hmm.
If he does, in my opinion, it's going to be for all the wrong reasons. But we still have to, understand that he's made choices that he's made
Sure.
on, his counsel, who he chose to be his attorney, the guy he hired, what kind of money and resources he has available, and sadly, that's kind of the the plight of any inner city urban person in terms of the the resources that they have available to them. So,
Well, and there's so much to the machinations of this case, and here in episode 5 here, we'll get into a lot of it. But as
yeah,
you mentioned, I don't know if it was this episode or another one. It depends on how everything plays out. Like you said, if it becomes a referendum on Greg Kading, it's a high likelihood that Keefe D walks. But again, who
sure.
knows how this all plays out? Because man, as we've gone through, and here it is, episode 5, so many different. I mean, as you kind of checked yourself, if necessarily malfeasance, but just kind of not playing by the rules. But there's been some effery in all of this. Then hopefully,
Yeah, there has been. You're absolutely right.
yeah,
There's been a lot of manipulation going on. I was personally surprised that that Vegas actually included the interview that they did with Dwayne Davis. I was very surprised by that. That they actually decided to include that as evidence in their court filings, because of the amount of coercion that was being done there.
and we're going to
Um,
talk about that. Are you talking about the September 9th, 2009
yeah,
interview? Okay,
that's the
cool.
one. Yeah.
Yeah,
So let's back up to the beginning of the show. I think when we start the show, I think Greg Kading's on his way out of the LAPD.
he
Uh,
definitely is. He's being removed from the task force. It opens up. This episode 5 opens up with Frank Alexander saying, "What's up, man? All these people had so much love for Tupac, but where are these rewards? Where are these people helping to facilitate getting justice for Pac?" And we also, Jesse Surratt gets in there, starts kind of asking some of the same questions about, what happens to people who aren't maintaining this narrative. And of course, we have Reggie get in there talking about, this play, threatening people kind of subtly and surreptitiously. And, he plays both sides. I know how to do this and blah, blah, blah. So this is how we kick off episode 5. And as you said, we get into the bad cop from the last episode, Greg Kading, and how he's been removed from so many different cases, so many different convictions are overturned. A lot of it has to do with his Jose Ramos case. Talk about that a little bit and how we kick this one off, and we meet more of the acquaintance of Mr. Greg Kading.
well, yeah, I think and it's funny because we're actually going to deep dive a little bit further into the George Torres Ramos case. There were some things we learned about it after we did the show that we learned that were actually even more damning and more problematic for Mr. Kading than he's ever let on. And one of them involves the attorney by the name of Wayne Higgins. And Wayne Higgins is actually the attorney that represented, and I put double quotes around that, air quotes, if you will, around Keith Davis. He represented Keith Davis in all of these ongoing the interviews. I mean, the Greg Kading wants to pretend like a proffer session is this unlimited get out of jail free card. As many times as we want to talk to you, you're going to tell us the truth, and it's this big operating agreement. And that's not what a proffer session is. Let's just knock that out.
Right.
We talked about that a lot before, but he preys on people's ignorance that they don't know what a proffer session is. But at any rate, the attorney that would have normally represented Keith Davis was a guy by the name of Edie Fall. And Edie Fall had already eaten Greg Kading's lunch a couple of times in previous court cases where he just, he was representing somebody that Greg Kading was building a case against. And Kading couldn't push it past the finish line, couldn't get the conviction. So he didn't like Edie Fall because Edie Fall was a good defense attorney. Edie Fall represented Keith Davis for years. They've been friends. And excuse me, as Kading had written in his book, so I'm not making anything up here that's not, already been said.
Right.
He, when he confronted Keith Davis in the garage of Keith Davis's house, which is a really suspicious and weird incident all by itself, but they allegedly confronted him there at his garage. And they were telling him about this case that they had put against him and that he was going to go to jail for the rest of his known life, et cetera, and threatening him. And as Kading left, he told Dwayne Davis, "You can't have Edie Fall represent you. I won't talk to you. We won't deal with you if you have Edie Fall represent you." Which is, I mean, that's coercion all by itself. I mean, who in the hell are you to say what attorney can represent you, what attorney
Right.
can't represent you? He's going around, so he's already quote unquote cooking the books. But you get then out of nowhere comes this other attorney by the name of Wayne Higgins. Now, Wayne Higgins, to you and me, we don't know who this guy is, and apparently neither did Keith Davis, according to Keith D's son. He was getting ready to be taken to school when this whole incident showed up, and apparently Wayne Higgins was introduced to Keith Davis along with other promises of leniency, et cetera, if he went and used Wayne Higgins. Well, going back to the George Torres Ramos case, we come to find out that Greg Kading and Wayne Higgins enjoyed a nice little tight relationship in the fact that the guys that were testifying as star witnesses against George Torres Ramos in the George Torres Ramos case, and these are the same ones that Greg Kading, promised the cars and the money to and all this kind of stuff. These guys were represented by none other than Wayne Higgins, same attorney. And then we come to find out that Mr. Higgins got in a little bit of trouble, as did Mr. Kading, because there was a little bit of bribery involved with Mr. Higgins, where Mr. Kading decided that it was a good idea to offer some GPS and some, car stereo enhancements for Mr. Higgins' car and make that bribe to the attorney for his witnesses that he was compelling to testify against George Torres Ramos. So
interesting.
Yeah, we're really starting to pull the string on that one to find out how dirty Wayne Higgins really was as an attorney. He's dead now, so I don't give a crap about his feelings on it. But we definitely do have the problems with Greg Kading and dealing with defense attorneys and and witness attorneys and
well, just more information that illustrates that this dude is not on the up and up in any way, shape, or form. He's shady as the day is long. Yeah, and then he's removed from his cases, and especially the pot case. He's being found to have been taking copies and evidence from these cases and taking it home. And as Phil Carson is like, dude, WTF? Why would you not hand this to the people taking over the case to help facilitate justice? And that's clearly not what he does. He writes a book and makes a movie, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it's interesting because he made, I mean, again, going back to his book, his own words, which he may or may not have regretted saying at this point, but he makes it clear that they had no intention, the LAPD had no intention of sharing anything that they had with Vegas PD. Right. None. They intentionally were withholding information from them. So the fact that Greg Kading gets thrown off the task force and within weeks, suddenly there's a communication between the Los Angeles Police Department and Vegas Police, which is very strange anyway, because you got to go back to the fact that Kading had no business in the Tupac case at all. The LAPD had no business in the Tupac case, and Phil Carson makes that very clear. Wasn't their case. Biggie was their case, and maybe there was some common players, but PPD had already been looked at for Biggie years prior to that. Nothing to do with it at all. So now all of a sudden they're working the Biggie task force. Greg Kading suddenly comes up with some PCP case that they're building up against Keith Davis, which he also says in his book that they have no intention of prosecuting. One day I was talking with Phil Carson about this off the record. We were just talking a little bit about it. And I said, Phil, let me ask you a question. If you are a federal drug enforcement agency, a DEA or an ATF or an FBI or give you the three letters that you want to put in there, you're an agency. And you come up with this guy who wants to build this big drug case about this meth and what they PCP, that's what it was, PCP case against Keith Davis, and they're going to use federal drug money to go buy the drugs with, and they're going to do all of this involving a big federal investigation. Okay. If he had told those investigators that had spent countless hours setting all this up and working with him, that he had no intention of prosecuting the cases, do you think those guys would have ever have moved a muscle? Of course not. That's the dumbest thing you've ever heard, to have Kading sit there and say that he got all these guys, all these federal task force people to work with him and buy drugs and do all that for having no intention of prosecuting Keith Davis at all. Insane. Now you understand why he has no relationship with the other cops that are in the task force. Right. Because these guys are thinking they're going to go make an arrest. This is how these guys get bonuses. This is how they get advanced. They care about crimes that are happening right now. So if there's a drug crime that's happening right now, that's what they're going to be interested in. If you're at the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement, ATF, firearms. Those are the things they care about. They don't care about a 25, 30-year-old murder investigation, a
Right.
cold one. They don't care about that. But somehow Kading managed to con all of those people. And I will say it was a con because I guarantee you, not a single one of those agents would have lifted a finger to help Greg Kading with federal drug money, buy money, and all that stuff to build a case against Keith Davis if they didn't think that that case was going to be prosecuted. So
Right.
that's a con job. Immediately, that's a con job. Okay, that he conned all those guys. So he builds up this quote unquote alleged PCP case. Now, did he ever press charges? Nope. He had no intention of pressing charges. But when you look at revisionist history, I kind of wonder what the charges would have looked like if he had tried to press charges after Torres Ramos blew up.
Right.
You know what I mean? What prosecutor in their right mind would ever take a drug case put up there by Greg Kading, the master of having 49 counts against convictions, by the way, overturned against George Torres Ramos? See, a lot of people think George Torres Ramos that he just lost, that Kading just lost the case. No, George Torres Ramos was convicted of 49 counts, felonies. He was convicted. It was an appeal that they went back after Greg Kading. And it was so bad that the whole thing got overturned. Okay? Greg Kading
Interesting.
didn't just lose this case. Greg Kading screwed that case. Royally screwed that case. And so that's why they had to get rid of him. You know, Steve Strong makes a good point of it in the show. You're of no use to the LAPD as a credible witness anymore. You can't testify. And more importantly, all those cases, other cases that Greg Kading had done and gotten people thrown in jail for in the last 5 years leading up to that, if he screwed this case up so bad, it could stand a chance that all those other cases could get overturned as well. So the
Well, and this
LAPD,
gets
like, you
into,
got to go.
what we're dealing with now, and you talk about it, all of this information that I'm sorry, Greg has been pushing towards. It's all fruit from the poisonous tree, so it's like it's almost null and a lot of it's somewhat null and void because it's all just tainted from beginning. And something you just brought up, and I've always had, just watching this, had major questions. It is a Las Vegas case, and why is LAPD so determined to be a part of it? And as Keefe D gets wrapped up in this, the LAPD officers offer an interview with Keefe D to the Las Vegas Police Department, but Las Vegas says they require Kading's former partner Darren Dupree to be there, and the interview has to happen in LA. I guess I'm
Well,
curious,
that
why
was
is
LAPD that said that. That wasn't Vegas PD that said that. Vegas PD didn't put those kinds of constraints on it.
okay,
No,
must have misunderstood. Okay.
this was all being driven by the LAPD and by Darren Dupree, which, by the way, Darren Dupree's a corrupt cop himself. I mean, he got caught having a conversation with his wife on a drug dealer's cloned cell phone. Okay,
Well,
asking
I
some
guess
of
I'm
his
wondering, why
questions.
wouldn't Las Vegas? I don't know how standard this is to cross jurisdictional lines, have these interviews with these conditions. Why wouldn't Las Vegas be like, go fuck yourself? We're gonna have this conversation with Keefe by ourselves, because it almost stands to reason. Like, you're trying to dictate and steer this narrative. We're not going to allow that. We want legit information from Keefe without you guys tainting the waters, as we
Well,
see happen.
I think part of it is that Vegas didn't care. I mean, I think that Vegas didn't trust LAPD. So when LAPD says, "Hey, we got a guy that's interested," they're like, "Okay, yeah, is that like the last guy you brought, that Orlando Anderson guy? There's nothing on him." So oh, this is Orlando Anderson's uncle. Oh, okay. Well, gee, that makes it even more ridiculous than the first one you sent. But okay, not to be rude, but since you're putting him up there and you're offering him to us, yeah, we'll send a guy out. And that was what was done. I mean, it was pretty clear that Vegas already knew that LAPD was hiding information from them. That wasn't a
Okay.
secret. That wasn't a mystery. But when LAPD said, "Yeah, we got a guy you can talk to," they started putting all these caveats on it. They said, "Okay, well, you got to come to where we're at. We're not bringing him there. We're not taking him to Vegas." Number one. Number two, our guy has to be in that meeting with you and his attorney. Uh, this Wayne Higgins guy
Yeah.
is in this meeting, and they have to be there. And you can come and you can ask whatever question you want, but we're doing it at robbery homicide. We're doing it in the inner sanctum, if you will, um, of the LAPD. I mean,
Yeah.
when Russ and I went there to robbery homicide, we were buzzed through at least four doors. to get up there. And it brings up the question because this really becomes a constitutional rights question with KVD in the fact that when he was being questioned, he wasn't read his rights. He wasn't given his Miranda rights at the beginning of that interview. Okay. And they were interviewing him, asking him questions about things. He did have an attorney present, but did he feel like he was being interrogated or was he being questioned? Because if you have in our Constitution, if you have a freedom of mobility issue, in other words, if I can't just get up and walk out, okay, then I'm under arrest.
Right.
I'm being detained. I'm being physically controlled by the police. So when Darren Dupree, hey buddy, come on over here, buddy, and puts Keith Davis down in the chair behind 5 different buzz doors, Keith Davis can't walk out of that place. He's under no belief whatsoever that he is anything but being captive at that point. And that's, of course, when you're being involuntarily confined, that's when your Miranda rights kick in, and he was given none of those rights.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so that's a little bit about how that all worked. But when they got there, you know, and it jumped off to everybody, including Phil, when we read the transcript of the interview, that you know, Keefe D and his relationship with Darren Dupree, the cop that was suspended for talking on drug dealers' phones and that kind of thing, you know, that Keefe D has such a cozy relationship with him. He's got a nickname for him. He calls him D Boy.
Yeah.
Which is another name for dope boy.
You're
but
right.
I don't think that was the connotation. He was just giving him a nice nickname because he liked him and they got along so well. And in fact, at one point in this conversation, Keefe D starts feeling uncomfortable about the questions being asked. He asked Dupree to coach him, and Dupree asked that the Vegas PD step out of the room.
Another huge red flag.
Yeah.
And is this when, again, so I didn't know if that, I didn't know, maybe you said that in the show that they stepped out of the room, but how are these guys? How is, who was it? I'm sorry. Detective Long from LV, Las Vegas Police Department. He's the one who meets with Keefe. And did he step out of the room when Darren Dupree's like, hey, you need to stick to the story so you can sleep well?
Well, he
like
did.
That's so blatantly coercion.
Yeah, no, he did. He actually Long had stepped out of the room. And what these guys didn't realize was that Vegas Police was surreptitiously recording this meeting.
Yes.
Vegas was already making a meeting, like a pocket camcorder or a pen or whatever. They were recording this meeting. So when Long stepped out of the room, he knew he was going to catch what they were saying anyway. It's not an uncommon tactic with police that they'll leave the recorder on and then step out of the room, giving the illusion that they're not there, that these guys can talk freely amongst themselves. And talk freely, they freaking did. You know, Wayne Higgins started arguing with Darren Dupree, trying to coach Keith Davis on maybe you don't want to pin yourself in any corners here. Maybe you don't. Maybe you want to stay a little vague. Maybe you want to stay a little uncommitted to things. Keith Davis is like, well, I don't know, because this is how it happened, or maybe it didn't happen that way. And Darren Dupree starting to lose his shit because he's saying, hey, you got to stick to the story. The story's already out there. And what does he mean by the story's already out there? Greg Kading already put it in his book. Okay? Greg Kading's writing a book about all this stuff. Okay? Story's been out there. Greg Kading has been telling people this is what's going to be in his book. And so the more that Keith Davis starts to get confused, because Keith Davis isn't the sharpest stick in the shed, let's be honest. He doesn't understand what the questions are being asked from him. And Darren Dupree finally says, look, you have to stick to the story because it's already been told, and do that and you'll sleep well at night. Well, that was all I needed to hear.
Right.
When a cop says, we're gonna cause problems for you if you don't, and then you go back to the George Torres Ramos case, and you look at what happened when a witness actually worked against something Greg Kading wanted him to say. Greg Kading had told this one witness in the George Torres Ramos case to say certain things and stick to the story. That guy didn't stick to the story. So Greg Kading said, hey, dude, you effed us, and turned around and arrested the guy and threw him in jail.
Yeah.
All for crossing the story. So it really you have to ask yourself the question as to whether or not Keith Davis's story has been a convenient manufacture, or he's actually been afraid to tell a different story because you got a cop that's capable of hitting back.
And that's what Jesse talks about. Jay Mix, these guys have a history of hitting back for people who aren't following their prearranged narrative. And I guess this is speculation. I'm going to ask you. And obviously, you don't have to answer. But I mean, it's why in the world is Kading via the LAPD so adamant about pushing this Keefe Orlando narrative? It can't
Well,
be just for the book and for the documentary and stick to the story because we've already told that. I mean, why are we telling the story in the first place? Why are we so adamant about this?
well, that's a great question. There are so many people were invested in the Tupac narrative and all that, and of course that was set in motion, months before Biggie got clipped. When Biggie got clipped, and LAPD had to take over, and they started to see that there were commonalities between the two. Well, that, and especially after the Valletta Wallace lawsuit,
Right.
anything having to do with death row records, anything having to do with corrupt LAPD cops,
Right.
being involved with them, being in security for death row records, being seen at death row records parties,
Right.
the optics of it were just so bad
Yeah.
that the LAPD said, we're doing everything we can to try to keep anything but LAPD cops are in the middle of any of this.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Because that's unresolved even from Biggie. But when you take a look at your Kevin Gaines and you take a look at the fact that, unlike Keefe D, that they're having trouble actually placing him in Las Vegas, we have internal affairs memos from the LAPD saying that Kevin Gaines was in Las Vegas on a quote special assignment. We don't know what that is,
Right.
but he was on special assignment in Las Vegas. So we actually do have somebody that we can actually physically place in Las Vegas, and that's Kevin Gaines. Yet again, another LAPD cop. So,
And just to refresh, former LAPD cop had a relationship with Sharitha Knight. He was after a week or two after Biggie was killed. He was the one who was shot by Frank Laga, another LAPD cop. That's when Russell Poole got involved in all of this after the Kevin Gaines shooting. But he is speculated and alleged to potentially been involved in the Tupac thing in Las Vegas.
well, let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about motive for a minute. Everybody wants to be run quick, run go tell on Orlando Anderson that he got stomped inside a casino, and that gave him the motive to go out and retaliate against a gang of convicted felons, known shooters, carrying guns, and he's going to go after them with one gun. But that's okay because he was
Right.
supposedly so embarrassed, and the gang code kicked in, and he had to go kill Tupac because he got beat up at a casino. Okay, so he got humiliated. That's the motive you're going to go with. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about Kevin Gaines. Kevin Gaines was dating the wife of Death Row Records CEO Suge Knight at the time. We all know Suge Knight wasn't keen about that, wasn't happy about that. They've been dating for close to 4 years, so this wasn't a new relationship.
Right.
And this had been in his face for all that time. So, constantly getting teased about that. Well, there are two stories that are out there. I can't prove either one of them, but they're certainly hood lore. That Kevin Gaines was beat up, left for dead out in the middle of the desert, stripped down, no clothes,
I
had to
heard
walk
that. Yeah.
back. And then there's another story. I think it's even Sharif that tells the story that Kevin Gaines got beat up in a van. Suge pulled him into a van and had him beat up inside a van. Okay. So if you're going to believe that Orlando Anderson got beat up and that was enough to go kill Tupac, then why wouldn't you believe that a hothead LAPD cop
Right.
who was known for brandishing his weapons, who called 911 on himself, who was basically certifiable lunatic, that he gets humiliated, he gets beat up, he's dating Suge Knight's wife. Why the hell wouldn't he go take out Suge Knight and Tupac?
Right.
If you just want to talk about motive, I'm not saying he did it. I'm just
Well,
saying that if
and
you
this
want
is
to line up motive,
in tandem with the rumors of potential Sharitha and Reggie wanting to take over Death Row. So you
yeah, I mean,
remove,
yeah.
yeah,
But this
and this is
guy,
all
but
alleged,
this,
by the way, of course.
yeah, Orlando Anderson wasn't known for being a lunatic. Kevin Gaines was known for being a lunatic, flat out. He was known. He called 911 on himself.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, think about that. And yet, and Frank Laga blasted him away because he was brandishing a firearm, running around in the middle of the streets of L.A., brandishing a firearm, pointing a firearm at other drivers. So when you sit there and say, "Gee, you wonder if that guy's mentally unstable enough that if he's in Vegas on that night and he's had enough of Suge Knight that he's going after Suge Knight, Tupac's in the car, he don't give a damn, and he's out there and he's part of that. He's part of that hit." I'm not saying that that's the way it went down, but I'm saying if you just want to look at pure motive, if you're willing to believe Orlando Anderson, then you
Right.
got to be able to believe Kevin Gaines.
Way more
You
plausible.
can't you
The
can't
latter
separate
scenario
the
is way more plausible. Yeah,
yeah,
without a
you
doubt.
can't separate the two. This guy had way more motive to go after Suge Knight and or Tupac. I mean, the fact that
And
Tupac
the
was
cover up makes so much more sense too. Why do they
well,
give a shit
sure,
about Orlando? I mean, it just yeah, I
yeah.
and
I mean,
again in
there's
tandem with the Valletta Wallace potential $1 billion, 500 million to $1 billion lawsuit, it definitely makes
on a
sense.
whole
So
different matter. So you get a guy like Greg Kading who's known to be able to break the rules that you can actually, and I hate to say it, he was expendable. There's somebody that they pushed up the ladder, put him in charge of that investigation, hoping he would take it somewhere different, and he tried to take it someplace different, but it could never hold water. And when they found out that A, he was in trouble with the George Torres Ramos case, and B, that the Valletta Wallace case was being dismissed, they kicked him to the curb. He served his purpose. He was the useful idiot,
yes,
and was
plenty of
was able
those.
to to go there. So he went away, and then Darren Dupree, who was joined at the hip with the guy. I mean, they're two peas in a pod. They're equally corrupt.
Yeah.
That he decided to go ahead and offer up Keith Davis as a way to be transparent with Vegas about who they thought their lead guy was. Now, of course, it made such an impact on the Vegas police that they sat on it for 9 years and didn't do anything
Right.
about it.
Right.
Okay,
And I'm anxious to get into that part of it, but let's follow the sequence of this episode here. So on 7/29 2015, you receive a letter from Keefe D.
yeah. And so this whole thing about Keefe D, I read about it in LA Weekly. The book hadn't Greg Kading's book hadn't even come out yet, and I was curious about all of this because, like a lot of other people, Keith Davis's name had been through the washing machine so many times. I mean,
Right.
it was like bleached underwear. It was, pure because they'd raided his house several times. They'd served search warrants on his houses, his cars, himself. He'd been in and out of jail already. There wasn't anywhere left to look in the closet of Keith Davis for anything staggering, and everybody knew it. Yet this guy just shows up out of the blue, and this Detective Kading, whom I had met personally, who I knew personally, knew what he was about, had my suspicions because of the relationship that he had tried to push with Frank and all this, that there was a lot more under the cover. So when he decides he's going to write a book and he's talking about this Keith Davis guy, the first thing I did was I sent a complaint to the LAPD and I said, this guy's going to cause a lot of trouble for some people if he's trying to stir the pot. He's using aliases, which aren't very good aliases, but he's going out there and he's really, he's messing around with people's lives. And that was the first thing I did. The second thing that I did was I reached out to Keith Davis. He was in prison, and I took a very interesting position. Because I'm a documentary filmmaker, I said, hey, why don't we try it this way? Let me see if this Keith Davis is full of bullshit or not, because that's what I'd heard about him, was that he was just nothing but just bullshit, just hot air. And so I said, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I'm want to do a documentary film. I want to tell his story. But if the story that he told Greg Kading was the same story that he's going to tell me, then Greg Kading already told his story and there's no place for him to go. So the idea there being, I'm giving him an opportunity to say that it's all bullshit, even if he thinks it's because he wants to make a movie. Okay. So I gave him the opportunity, but if he was going to stick with his guns, and he kind of did a little bit, that he stuck with his guns on the Greg Kading thing, that um, he could go either way with it. And of course, he did write me back. We had a couple of correspondences back and forth, and then when he finally got out of prison, I agreed to meet him, and we had a meeting together. And the recording of that meeting is pretty famous now. Of him talking about how it was all bullshit. That everything he told Greg Kading, he didn't have 25 years, and so he just told Greg Kading what Greg Kading wanted to hear. And
And
and that
somewhat, I
was
guess, misunderstood the parameters of the quote unquote proffer because, like you said, he goes on to just run his mouth over and over and over, doubling down on his book and this Orlando Anderson narrative.
well. There's no law in the United States against lying. You can we have freedom
True.
of speech.
Facts, whole facts.
You can lie. You can lie all day. You can tell stories. And if I had a nickel for every rapper that's out there that's made up a bunch of bullshit and backstory and things that they said that they did, I mean, even Napoleon of the Outlaws just did an interview on Vlad not long ago, and he's running around talking about how Tupac going to death row was a big chess move and strategic and this, that, and the other. And it's like this kid wasn't even 16 years old when this was all happening. Okay. So he knew nothing about what was going on. But if people feel free to tell all the stories and make up a bunch of bullshit. And I think what happened was Keith Davis got tired of seeing everybody else tell a bunch of bullshit, make money off of Vlad, get paid for these idiots that'll just
Yeah.
listen, give you a microphone and listen to you blab. They don't challenge you. They don't ask you any questions. They don't try to check your story. They let him tell the story, and they let him tell a different story every time. But nothing could stop somebody from creating a public persona, even if it's not so good for you or not so good for your family.
Well, and
And
not
that's
to,
what he
it's,
did.
but this is pretty much what the jury or what they're working on in this Las Vegas case. There's no gun, there's no witnesses. They're pretty much just going off of him gassing himself up, silent, like you said, lying for the sake of
Well,
clicks or views or the book sales or whatever.
it is, and what's interesting though, and this is where it gets very curious for me, and we're going to actually talk a lot more about this in season 2 of the show, is that of all the places that Keith Davis could have moved to,
Las
moving to
Vegas.
Vegas was a really bad idea, probably in the history of bad ideas,
I thought that was interesting
because
too. Yeah.
if he had been tried, if they could have obviously tried to get him in California and put him up in California, because if there was this big plan to go kill somebody and stuff like that, those plans started in L.A. with the alleged Diddy money for killing him and stuff like that.
Ah,
So
yes.
and that predated any activity that was going on in Las Vegas the night of September 6th, September 7th. There all of that was predated. So you could make the argument that the LA may have jurisdiction over that because the plotting and the conspiring, as Keith
True.
Davis talked about it, started in Los Angeles, and it now becomes an interstate matter, and but LA would be carrying the water on that.
But they would
Now,
have to go with that narrative of the Eric Von Zip, Puffy,
yeah,
million dollar
yeah,
check. Okay.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's still elements of that cooking around in the Vegas case. But
Right.
what was interesting about Las Vegas, and I've had several conversations with people about this recently, and I think your listeners will find it very, very curious. Las Vegas had a big problem, going back 40, 50 years ago. They had a major problem with organized crime, the mob. And the mob ran things, and it was very violent, and it was a very destructive time, and they really wanted to get rid of the mob in Las Vegas, or at least put them in check to where they were a little bit more managed, and things just weren't a three-ring circus in Las Vegas. And one of the things you have to understand, if you go back historically, is that the mob came from New York. The mob came from Chicago. The mob came from Philadelphia. The mob came from Pittsburgh. It came from places where there had been hundreds of years of laws on the books. And if you look at most laws in most cities, they're pretty much the same. Most states' laws are the same. They're based on a certain code of honesty and integrity. And if you steal, you go to jail. If you shoplift, you go to jail. If commit fraud, there are penalties for that. And so the mob, over the 100 years or so that they got to, all the immigrants came over from into New York from overseas, brought a lot of the Cosa Nostra stuff with them. They learned what the laws were in the United States, and they learned how to skirt those laws. They learned if you go to the left too far, go to the right too far, you stay clear of those, then you've got this kind of ambiguous lane in which they operated and did all their operations in. So skirting the law was something that became kind of an art form to the mob, because your laws in Chicago are the same as New York, same as Philadelphia, same as that. The way that Vegas cooked the mob years later was because somebody got really smart in Vegas and said, hey, wait a minute, why do our laws have to be like everybody else's? If the mob guys are doing this and doing that, and they're skirting the laws of every other state, then why don't we make what they're skirting, why don't we make that illegal too? And now they got nowhere to run, because they were so used to playing the margins that if Vegas set their laws up to be like every other city in the United States, then they knew how to operate. But
Mhm.
Vegas started throwing around some really crazy ass laws. They started making up some laws that nobody had even contemplated before. Not to sound superlative, but it's like Trump saying, laws that nobody had ever heard of before. These laws came out, and one of them was if you bragged about committing a crime, you could be held liable for it. Okay. If you told a third person that you committed a crime, you could be charged with that crime. Now, that's
Mm.
not a law that's very popular in Los Angeles or Philadelphia or New York or Chicago, or anyplace else. But there were a lot of mob guys that would like to talk. And they like to talk on wiretaps. I think we remember that scene from Goodfellas in the grocery store where he's going on and on and on, and they're recording everything and wiretapping him. But in Vegas, they made it a law that if you told a third person and they could verify that you said that to them, that carried weight. That would normally be considered hearsay evidence. Okay. And it is hearsay evidence. But in Vegas, they actually gave more legal weight to hearsay
Interesting.
evidence than any other state in the United States. And that's how they got the mob out, because they were able to change their laws and make their laws different than other states' laws. And that's why you have that thing about telling somebody else as a third party. Hearsay evidence is huge in Vegas now.
Interesting. Did not know that.
And so Vegas is kind of like the one place, if he lived anyplace else, the prosecutors may have had a very difficult time weighing out the probative value of hearsay evidence.
Mm.
But they have those things. There are some other laws. I'll think about them. Maybe in the next conversation we have, I'll think a little bit more about them. But we definitely are looking at how there are certain nuances to laws that you and I think, well, there's no way, there's no gun, there's no this, there's no that. Yeah, you're right. And in any other state, that would be a problem. In Las Vegas, not so much of a problem,
Yeah.
because they needed to convict the mob guys and they couldn't get them playing the same game that everybody else played. So they play a different game.
Wow. That could be a big sticking point, like you said, for all the interviews and the books, etc. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, I
Another
think yeah, that spun my head. It really did.
Well, another thing that spun my head, based off of Kading's book, and I don't know if the movies had been dropped yet, but the FBI told Keefe that he needs to sue Kading in the city of LA. Everybody, who propagated this narrative, because they were saying to him, they're putting your life in danger. For to some degree, the FBI had Keefe's back.
Well, they did, because Keefe D was a federal informant. Okay, and
Yes, going back to 1998, I believe it was.
yes, and we make that very clear in the documentary. Of course, yes, he was a federal informant, and that 1998 way predates Greg Kading. So it isn't like Greg
Yeah,
Kading said he found this guy Keefe D sitting on a street corner somewhere and said, "Hey, you want to be a federal informant because I'm a junior G man, deputized,
yeah,
Fed guy. I'm a temporary field officer, whatever bullshit junior G man badge they gave him."
right.
It wasn't like he found Keefe D standing on a street corner and said, "Hey, by the way, you too can be a federal informant." Okay. No, this goes all the way back to 98. This goes all the way back to before he was ever strung up on his earlier drug charges, gun charges, things like
Yeah,
that he was already a federal informant. So, yeah, he had a long and storied relationship with the federal government, which really makes you wonder why Greg Kading was trying to push so hard to sequester him into the whole Tupac thing, when
right.
maybe there was a better case with the PCP case and all that to prosecute him on it. But somehow we jumped tracks, and this is the narrative of the movie. Somehow, Jeff, we actually jumped tracks from, you got this PCP case, you're dealing with a drug dealer. So, yeah, forget about all that. Let's talk about a 30-year-old case, simply because, hey, I want to tell you something and you're not going to fucking believe it.
Right.
Okay, well, first off, you're probably right. I probably wouldn't believe it, number one. But number two, who's to say that that wasn't a long rehearsed proposition? Okay. We know that Kading had many, many meetings with Keith Davis. We know that they were recorded. We know that his task force, the people that were on Kading's task force, have said that they always recorded the sessions with Keith Davis. And there was 10 to 12 of them, they said, that they did with him. Okay. And they never did them at the police station where they should have. They did it at Wayne Higgins' office. And if that isn't, now we brought it around full circle. Okay. Wayne
Mm.
Higgins' name popped back up again. Why would you be having interviews with a potential witness at some attorney's office and not at the police station where interrogations are generally done?
Right. Officially.
Why would you do that unless you've got a cooperating witness? And once
Mm.
you determine whether or not Keith Davis was in any way, shape, or form cooperating with Kading or Dupree or Higgins, then it suddenly calls into question, okay, what level of degree are we now? Are we dealing with some big conspiracy theory regarding one gun given by Von Zip to take on the whole Suge Knight army
Right.
and all that bullshit? Or is it a couple of guys that got together with a guy that could endorse the Orlando Anderson thing and they made a plan to make a bunch of money
Which
together?
they did. Which they
Well,
did.
well, a couple
Not a
of them
bunch.
did. At first, a couple of them did, and then they didn't. And then you come to find out that somehow Keith Davis ends up on Death Row Chronicles. That was the first big interview that he did. Allegedly, got paid $100,000 for doing that interview. That he got that money through. Well, how did the producers get a hold of him? Oh, that's pretty easy. Mike Dorsey, who worked with Greg Kading on the Murder Rap documentary, was not only interviewed in the show, he was actually a consultant on that show. Okay. So it doesn't take long for Mike Dorsey to, and Greg Kading was interviewed in the documentary. It doesn't take long for them to reach out to Keith Davis. This is the guy that they're saying should be thrown in jail. And they're arranging to get him paid $100,000 to do an interview. It's really, really strange optics there, if you don't mind my saying. It's a really strange set of optics.
Well, and I
Because
don't know the timeline on this, but hearing Phil Carson saying when he's watching or hearing about the TV show Unsolved and the book and everything, but particularly the TV show, I don't know if he was saying he reached out to the producers, but he's like, WTF, you guys, this is all wrong. Have no one done their due diligence here? And he said apparently the producer didn't really give a fuck, but he
no,
let them know, like, you guys, this is all inaccurate that you guys are running with right here.
absolutely, and the sad part about it is that they made Unsolved a work of fiction that was congruent with being nice to the LAPD. It sullied them up a little bit, but was no big thing there. They discredited Russell Poole as being a nut job, and they credited Kading as being the guy who close the case, although I think calling the show Unsolved is probably the best thing they could have done because nobody solved this case. Okay. Kading hasn't solved this case. And I'm not even sure that a conviction in the Las Vegas court would mean that Kading solved anything. Okay.
Regardless of what DJ Vlad says, Kading did not solve the case.
Well, and DJ Vlad didn't solve anything either. I mean, that guy's so full of himself. It's just not even funny. But that's okay. I mean, like he makes a living off of
Right. Yeah.
interviewing people that he can tell what to interview. It was very telling, and we did have it in the documentary. It was a last minute ad when in the Keefe D. Bail hearing, they interviewed Whack 100, and Whack 100 spilled the beans on DJ Vlad and how before they sit down and do an interview, DJ Vlad talks about what's the most exciting thing or what's the big statement that he wants to get out of the interview before they, sit there like a trained seal and get their fish.
Right.
Napoleon's interview is a perfect example of that. I just the only edits I was looking for was when they actually physically threw him a fish. Um, do that bit. So you've got these guys, but Whack 100 said, "Hey, nobody says that we have to be honest in a Vlad TV interview. That was all I needed to hear, and that sunk his whole boat as far as I was concerned."
Jeez.
So yeah, that's the part about it is that they're looking for the sensationalism. And what's funny is that for the amount of material that Vlad has, and this is all I'm going to say about the guy because I really don't like to spend a lot of time on him. For all the material that this guy has and all the interviews that he's done with people, have you ever seen this guy one time ever actually try to stitch any of that together to make something make sense?
Right. It's all the
No,
sensational stuff.
no. It's all sensational, and yet it's funny because if you have that kind of volume of interviews and that, and it's supposed to mean something, then make it mean something. All it means to
Right.
him is that he gets a bunch of trained SEALs up there on a platform. I'm embarrassed that Bobby Kennedy. I just understand why he did it, why he got Bobby Kennedy up there. That kind of broke the mold for me in terms of the trained SEALs, because I had a lot of respect for Bobby Kennedy. But in terms of him paying people to sit there boozy badass in his Batman house, out in a swamp someplace, he's a content creator for YouTube. That's what he does. He doesn't have
Right.
to tell the truth. His stuff doesn't have to make any sense. It doesn't have to be honest. And yet with all those interviews, he's just squandered an opportunity away. So for him to sit there and try to take credit for doing anything, the
Yeah.
only thing he's done is he's fed a bunch of trained SEAls. That's all. That's all he's
That
done.
some of them have wound up locked up, but we won't get into that.
Yeah,
Well,
right. Exactly. Yeah, that's
as
right.
we move along, and I brought this up to you, I don't know, maybe before we even started this, because I was always fascinated by this. Um, 1998, there was a confession letter. What was that confession letter, and who confessed, and what was the gist of this confession letter?
There's a lot to unpack there. In
Summarize, if you will.
No, that's okay. No, in 2014, a 2013 timeframe, Russ Poole and I were at Fox TV, and we were there with Sandy Rivera, who's an attorney. And you always take attorneys with you when you go to talk to people, because attorneys are basically the best witness you can get in terms of when somebody says something or promises you something or recalls something. And Russell and I were working on the book Tupac 187, about the killing. And we went to Fox News to talk to a reporter by the name of Chris Blatchford. And Chris Blatchford, he's still around. He's not actively doing news anymore, but I think he's got a podcast. Chris Blatchford was the beat reporter for Fox News in the Compton, Inglewood, South Bay area during that time, during the mid 90s. Knew Suge Knight's parents, watched Suge Knight grow up, watched Reggie Wright grow up, knew all the players in that because he was the local newsman when Fox was a local Los Angeles television station. And so when you want to go and you want to fact check things that were happening in the 90s, and it's now 20 years later, you go to the people that would have kept the best notes, would have had the best recollection of things going on. And Chris Blatchford knew Russ Poole because that was part of the news at the time in the 90s, and knew Russ real well. And so we took Sandy Rivera and we went to Fox News because we were largely just fact checking things in our book. We spent a couple hours with him sitting at a big conference table, and he got all his notes out from different interviews that he had done over the years, and we were spot checking just to make sure we had kind of details down right. And at the end of the meeting, Chris asked us, we were wrapping up, and Chris said, I've got this letter that's been in my file since 98, and it's something that I've been meaning to want to follow up on. I just never got the chance to follow up on it. And I said, well, what's the letter about? He says, well, it's very interesting because it's from a person who claims that they have inside knowledge on the murder of Tupac Shakur. And I said, okay, well, them and people that said that Oprah did it, there's a number in line for everybody. And he said, well, the interesting thing about this was that I actually talked to this guy. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, I actually did a pre-interview with him because he was introduced to me. This fella, his name was Danny Patton, was introduced to me by a confidential informant that I had used for years, that had been very reliable on connecting me with people that knew the inside story of big crimes that had happened in the LA area during that time. And Chris Blatchford told Russ and I that this confidential informant had come and given the name of this Patton guy, who, by the way, also shows up in Tim Brennan's gang sweep affidavit. Okay, not only as Danny Patton, but as his moniker, White Boy. And it's allegedly, according to Chris Blatchford, this same Danny Patton, this same White Boy, who is now making claims that he was somehow involved in the murder of Tupac Shakur. So Chris Blatchford decided to go ahead and get on the phone with this guy because obviously, the news stations back in those days were trying to beat the police in terms of solving crimes because it meant huge ratings, it meant Pulitzer Prizes, Emmy Awards, all of these accolades that could be thrown if a news channel could break a case faster than the cops could. That was always a very healthy competitive thing at the time. And LA being a big market, that was no different. So Chris Blatchford was very interested in talking to this Danny Patton guy. And as Chris Blatchford would explain it, and we have an affidavit from Chris Blatchford signed to this effect, that he got on the phone, had an almost hour and a half interview with this Danny Patton, asked him questions because Chris Blatchford was there during, before, and after the murder of Tupac Shakur in Compton, during the gang wars, during the 10-day war, during all of that time. Chris was there. He was boots on the ground. So if anybody would know about this, it would be him. And the other thing about it, Jeff, is that as a news reporter, they don't suffer fools lightly. They've been there, seen it. They know when people are bullshitting. So Chris started asking him questions about what he knew about the murder and all that. Kept him on the phone for an hour and a half. And it was such a strong interview, and Chris Blatchford was so compelled that this guy was likely telling the truth about what he had to say that he went back to Fox, talked to Dan Layton, who was his producer at the time. Two of them didn't get along very well. But Chris said, "Hey, I want a camera truck. I want a one of those opaque things that somebody sits behind. We're going to do that. We're going to get a hotel room. We're going to mic this guy up. He's going to go on camera and he's going to tell the story that he told me on the phone." And they did that. They got the camera crew. They took the truck. They went to the hotel. They got there and they waited. And they waited for this Patton guy to show up. And he didn't show up. He didn't show up. 3 hours go by now. Suddenly, some guy comes by with a letter. And this letter was alleged to have been dictated by Patton because Patton got cold feet and didn't want to do the interview. So he said, instead of that, I'm going to give you this letter. And in the letter, it's going to map out everything that I had to tell you on the phone. And here's the letter. And then maybe we can talk about it later. But in addition to that, I'm also going to give you the murder weapon. And the murder weapon is going to be given to you by a courier who's going to show up at Fox News headquarters at the security gate with a big heavy paper bag, and that's the murder weapon. So Chris immediately calls over to the security to let him know that, hey, there's a package that might be delivered for him. The security guy says, yeah, somebody already showed up. He had something in an old paper bag. It was heavy. It was clearly something that was heavy in that paper bag, asking for you. We told him you weren't there and we turned him away. So Chris says, now you go with the lapse fade. And now you have Chris Blatchford in 2014 talking to Russ and I, and he said, this letter is what I had. He says, I tried to set something up with the guy. The guy got cold feet, and that was the last I had heard from him. And I said, may I see the letter? And so he showed me a copy, made a copy of the letter, gave Russ a copy, gave me a copy, gave Sandy Rivera a copy of the letter. The letter's 2.5 pages long. Interestingly enough, the first words that I read, I just kind of zoom to the middle of that letter, and in the middle of that letter, it says Reginald Wright Jr. was giving directions on where they would be that night.
On where who would be that night?
Where Suge Knight and Tupac would be, where they would be, what their itineraries, what they would be doing that night.
Interesting.
Okay. Well, what made this compelling for me in a number of reasons, and again, I'm trying to keep this really short because we've done all kinds of stuff on it. What was compelling to me, number one, was that Danny Patton was a Loiters Park gang member. He was a bricklayer by trade. He built brick walls, construction by trade. Okay, he wasn't a rap artist, wasn't a hip hop guy. Kind of hung out tangentially with some of those guys in Tarzana at Reseda at one of the Interscope, not Interscope.
Death Row.
No, it wasn't Death Row. It wasn't. It was Priority Records. the other player in the rap game at that time,
Yeah.
where they kind of sent all the B teams to go record. And but neither the confidential informant that introduced the letter to Chris Blatchford, that gave him the letter and introduced him to Patton, or Patton, neither one of them were tied up with Death Row Records at all. They had no inside information of Death Row Records. So the fact that they were even putting out details in this confession letter, is what we called it, um, really started to turn my head, because this is the first time that I'd ever heard of an alternative theory that might be so completely out in left field that it might make sense. And so we started to investigate the letter. We did a number of things to investigate the letter. We did a number of things to verify that the things that were being claimed in that letter were true. Interestingly enough, when the Pattons denied any knowledge of the letter or being involved in the case, according to our experts, they flat out lied about it. When they were asked flat out, did you have anything to do with the murder of Tupac Shakur? And Patton said no. There's evidence that he was lying. Same thing, Little Half Dead. That was another part of the confession letter, was that the real motive for wanting to get rid of Tupac came from a very jealous member of Snoop Dogg's family, one of Snoop Dogg's cousins. His name was Little Half Dead. Donald Smith was his name. And that there was a jealousy over Tupac's misappropriation of what Little Half Dead thought was a song that he had wrote, turned out to be Tupac's Dear Mama, not a small song by any stretch of the imagination. But the confession letter goes on to say that this Little Half Dead gave a demo tape to Tupac in the early days of a song that was reminiscent of Dear Mama. Next thing he knows, Tupac's got a song out called Dear Mama, which everybody knows Tupac wrote. And this song came out, but according to Little Half Dead, he was pissed because he thought he'd been ripped off. So sometime later on that year in Reno, they confronted each other, and Tupac's guys, just like in the Orlando Anderson thing, Tupac said the word, and his guys beat this Little Half Dead guy within an inch of his life, beat the shit out of him. And, all for confronting him about stealing of demos. And so when the next thing you hear is that there's this big get together in LA at a park, and that the Lil Half Dead was there, and Reggie Wright was there, and David Kenner was there. All the right people were there, according to this letter written by a construction worker. Okay, I got to keep bringing you back to that.
Right.
That in the middle of all this, there's a plan that's hatched that they're going to take out Suge Knight, and Lil Half Dead wants to take out Tupac. And the reason they're going to take out Suge Knight was because Suge Knight was drawing too much attention to the gangs and the drug dealings that were going on. I mean, it's no secret now that the feds had four different federal cases against Death Row. Now we know Reggie Wright was informing on all of them. Okay, we know all of these things now. A letter written in 1998 didn't know any of that, didn't contemplate any of that. The letter just said that Suge Knight was drawing too much attention to people that didn't want that attention, and was exposing the drugs and all that, and the arms dealing, which we know it was now, especially now we know it was.
Yeah.
And that they wanted to take him out. And the Little Half Dead was so pissed off about being disrespected and being beat up. And by the way, if that doesn't sound like Orlando Anderson to you, I don't know what it does.
Right.
That this guy had it in him that he was going to take out Tupac. So you have this whole scenario being set up. They talk about barricades in the letter. They talk about how there were only so many barricades, that they'd set up the whole route, and that Reggie Wright had given him information about where they were going to be that night and the route that they were going to take, so that there would have been no escaping of it. So, there's this letter comes out in 1998.
Yeah.
Chris Blatchford sits on it, doesn't do anything with it. Time goes by. He asks us to take a look at it. We start taking a look at it, and of course, we know a lot more about what was going on back then than anybody would have even back then. Okay. But when I first saw that somebody pulled Reggie Wright Jr.'s name out of a hat in 1998, that's scary damning to me.
Right.
because you got to realize I had to pay in 2007. I had to pay $500 to Lauren Greenfield, who's a photographer, so that I could license a single picture of Reggie Wright Jr. because there was no mention of this guy, who he was, or even his picture on the internet. If you could imagine a time when that
Right.
actually existed. Okay.
Pre-bomb first, obviously.
Yeah. Pre 2000 videos later. Okay. In fact, even in 2009, I was lucky because Reggie Wright was in the courtroom during Suge's bail hearings. Reggie Wright was in the courtroom, so I was able to pick up some B-roll of him from Fox. Other than that, Reggie Wright Jr. made it a point to stay out of the way, to stay out of the radar. Okay. And now we know why, because all the piece of shit things he was doing with the FBI and being an informant and ratting out
Hmm.
Suge Knight and signing documents and doing all that kind of stuff. You know, there was a reason he was keeping undercover. It wasn't because he was some sinister actor. It was because he was a piece of shit and he was getting over on everybody and he didn't want to get caught. So, at any rate, when I saw that, I said, this has got to have some merit to it. So, Russ and Sandy and I went ahead and we started investigating that letter. And I still say that when you give Fox, I think it was, did a Fox or A&E. I think it was A&E because it was the Ben Crump show. They gave an opportunity for Little Half Dead to come clean and tell the truth about what was going on and what was being said in that letter. Of course, he denied it, but then he turned around on national television and made up a complete fabrication about events that happened earlier that day. Just like we caught Keith Davis doing, talking about meeting Tupac and Suge the day before and all that, and we
Right.
caught him on that. We caught Little Half Dead on national television completely fabricating a whole story involving Tupac and Suge. Why would he do that? If your goal is to deny that you had anything to do with any allegation in some letter that somebody wrote and you want to write that off, I would think the first thing you would do was tell the truth and not out yourself on public television lying about a whole certain set of events that never happened.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So he lies that, and then we took it further because our good friend Greg Kading was so hot to want to prove that anything I was saying was not true. Of course, and he applied that critical expert detective Clouseau thinking of his on how to prove RJ wrong, which by the way he hasn't yet. And
It's not going to happen. That can't
yeah,
happen.
well, and but he went ahead and he found the patents. I knew where the patents were. They just, they had no motivation to want to talk to me because when we went to the LAPD with the confession letter, Darren Dupree leaked the confession letter publicly and outed Russ and I as having this lead involving the patents. So clearly, and that was the intent by leaking the letter, was that we weren't going to publish the letter in a book at all. We gave it to the police department that we thought might have jurisdiction over it because these gangs were all in LA. They're all there. So
Maybe
we
I'm
were
crossing the
excited.
streams on what was Robert Saria's role in the letter. Did he give it to Chris Blackford? Is he the one responsible for getting that to Chris Blackford, the
Yeah,
Robert Saria
Robert
gentleman?
Robert Saria was the mailman. Robert Saria was the intermediary. Robert Saria had been a confidential informant for Blatchford for a number of years,
Okay.
and actually had helped the CHP foil a couple of big heists by providing good information. So, he was a pretty stand-up dude, but he was just a mailman. I mean, he had nothing to do with making up the story. You hear Kading want to say it, he did. You hear the Pattons say it. They say that Robert Saria made up the whole thing. Having known Robert Saria for years, I can tell you that that's an impossibility. He's not that he is not that smart that he could make up a story like this. Period.
What was the motivation, as he said? I don't know if he was locked up at the time, but Robert said after all of this stuff came out, he got raped. Was he in prison when this happened? When did this sexual assault occur?
Well,
And
yeah,
why did they do that if this was a bullshit letter
right.
that
Well,
he?
that's yes. Well, that's the point. Well, the a couple of loaded questions there. First off, when they did that interview with Little Half Dead, and then Greg Kading went and did the interview with the Pattons to try to disprove everything, they actually interviewed a couple of family members of Robert Saria's that hate him. They don't like him. And I'm not saying Robert Saria is a great guy. Robert Saria is, you know, he's gotten himself into a lot of trouble. He's broken the laws. The things that he's done. He accepts responsibility for, and he's done his prison time for it. He got out. So, but while he was in prison, they leaked that letter, and they leaked the letter, made sure that they knew Saria's name was tied up in it. They went on this whole smear campaign against Saria, all of it lies. Went on this whole thing against him to make him look like he was a piece of shit informant that was outing people and trying to get rightfully, or not rightfully, but wrongfully charged people thrown in jail in this whole thing. And unfortunately, Saria saw the worst end of all of it. Because we had no intention of putting Saria's name out publicly. That would have never happened. Because we took it to the LAPD first. Russell and I believe in law enforcement. We always believed that you give the information to law enforcement and you let them deal with it because it's not tainted. This letter was one of the first things that came across anybody's desk that didn't have the stench of anything tainting it.
Right.
There hadn't been any interviews done about this. The people hadn't been interviewed. The patents hadn't been interviewed. If LAPD and Darren Dupree instead of wanting to make a show of it because it didn't agree with their narrative that they were pushing on the Keith Davis narrative, if they had done what they were supposed to do and they had taken it and actually questioned the patents in a police station the right way with real detectives, we may have a completely different understanding about what was happening at that time than we do now. But because they were racing it, and this is our whole society now with leaks. Basically they took documents that were given to them, and thank God I actually put a PowerPoint banner around it to make the letter to where I just didn't give them a copy of the letter. I put it in a PowerPoint and I put some other watermarking on stuff on it so it was easy to identify if it did get leaked. Okay.
Smart move too, because that's how you were able to identify it, the border of the PowerPoint.
That is absolutely correct. When it came out the other side, and then you had people like Jesse being contacted by Kading, trying to tell him that about it. They interviewed the patents. And again, like I said, well, what do you do? Once he puts that interview with the patents out there and they're saying, no, we didn't do it, then you got to go to the experts and you got to go to the lie detection experts and you got to say, are they lying or are they telling the truth? And our lie detection experts, and I've got a big video about that makes it a lot of fun. We're going to go back and revisit that, I think, for season 2. That came out and said they're lying their asses off. So Jeez. you have all these things, and people keep asking. I mean, I get asked all the time, well, when are you ever going to go back to that again, or have you abandoned that? I haven't abandoned anything. I haven't abandoned the patent. I haven't abandoned the Kevin Gaines theory. I haven't abandoned that. The reason that we're stuck on the track that we're stuck on right now is because that the Orlando Anderson narrative has to be put down. The Orlando Anderson narrative has to be stopped and recognized that it's nothing more than a bunch of hot air. The Keith Davis narrative has to be stopped, and it has to be recognized for what it is, and that's a bunch of hot air. In both cases, you can't discuss the patents. You can't discuss Kevin Gaines. You can't discuss any of these things because that's taking all of the air out of the room.
Yeah.
It's sucking all the air out of the room. And Vegas police, because they want to close this so bad, okay, for all the wrong reasons, because they got sued and they lost, and they had to actually prove that they were actually doing something in the case.
That's a huge part, and I want to get into that here in a minute as we wind down episode 5. Kicking the can down the road some more as we move along. We're looking at, I found this very fascinating too, and I'll be anxious to hear your response to this. Death Row Dave Matthews talks about Reggie having a security meeting at the Luxor around 3 or 4 the day of the shooting, saying not to carry weapons. Now, does this as separate in addition to the meeting that they had the same day at George Kalesi's office, saying the same thing to disarm?
Well, I think there was 3 significant events that happened during that time. The first one was the meeting that happened at George Kalesi's office, where key individuals were there and they were told, that for whatever reason, right wing security people were not allowed to carry the weapons. I think that there was a meeting at TGI Fridays that happened later where Michael Moore was arguing about it, and that's when he was reassigned. And then the third one, Death Row Dave Matthews talks about a meeting that happened at the Luxor. Now, I don't know that Reggie Wright Jr. was actually at the Luxor. You have to understand that Reggie Wright had a couple of guys like Al Giddens and a couple other people that were basically his lieutenants, if you wanted to call him that. Reggie
Mm-hmm.
was in charge of the security company, and he had a couple of people like Gal Giddens was calling Michael Moore all night, checking to see where Michael Moore was at. And then he finally said, I stop calling me. I want to talk to Reggie directly. Well, see, that's going up the food chain, so to speak. So there was a middle layer of management within right way security, and that would have been by Al Giddens. Maybe Tim Williams even might have been involved with that to some degree, but we know that there was. So if there was a meeting at the Luxor and people were told not to carry any weapons, that may not have been a right way security meeting. That may have been a meeting from Al Giddens. It could have been from
Right.
Tim Williams. It could have been from any number of people, even Kalisis himself. Although there's even question as to whether or not that was Kalisis that told him don't carry anything.
Right.
We don't know.
Well, and the need to check the 20 and check the whereabouts on Michael Moore that you just alluded to, because in whichever meeting it was, Michael was adamant, I'm not taking my gun off me. So there was a
Right.
huge effort to make sure we knew his location because we did not want somebody with guns around Tupac. Make sure he's
Right.
at Club 662. Let's make sure he's not anywhere near Pac. Make sure he's at Club 662. Thus, the constant phone calls. And he's like, stop fucking calling me. I'm not supposed to be at the club till 10 o'clock or whatever. Stop blowing up my phone.
Well, not
So
just
just
that, but Jesse makes a perfectly good point when he says if not carrying a weapon was so important, and they kept saying don't carry your weapons, don't carry your weapon. Michael Moore says I'm carrying my weapon. What do? They send him to Club 662. Now Reggie's been lying about this for years, and he's been saying that, oh, we were having some charity event going on at Club 662, and it wouldn't be a good idea to have all these armed gangster guys showing up and having guns and all these guns around during this Club 662. Is supposed to be a charitable event. And it was a conditional use permit that they had at the time. Well, if you've got 14 Las Vegas Metro officers that are there that are all armed, and Reggie's armed, and he admits that he was armed, and then they bring Michael Moore, who's armed, doesn't want to take off his weapon, instead of just sending him home, they tell him to go over to the place that Reggie's been saying for years they didn't want to have any guns at.
right.
Okay, that makes yet again it
No
falls
sense.
apart under its own weight every single time. But yeah, so Michael Moore's being told that, but at the same time, Death Row Dave Matthews, and I'm guessing this is probably homeboy security, and that's that second layer of security that were the entourage, Suge's friends and
Right.
convicted
Pops.
felons and Buntry and all these guys,
Right.
and they were told that, but I guarantee you none of them listened. Okay, guaranteed none of them listened. In fact,
Right.
they keep trying to talk about how Buntry shot back at the Cadillac. Well, there's never been any proof of that, but they still say that he did. Well, if he was unarmed, then how would that have happened? Okay, if he listened. So, and it makes the whole Keith Davis narrative even more ridiculous because with all these guys running around, you got 24 armed people at Club 662. You have another half a dozen to a dozen armed people in the entourage on their way to Club 662 from Suge Knight's house.
Right.
Okay. And then you have Keith Davis, who decides to get a single firearm from Zip Martin and drive to Club 662, parking in the back of the parking lot with the 24 armed police
Right.
officers
Right.
and with one gun, and then saying, "Oh, fuck it, why not?" And then approaching the entourage with Tupac and Suge with all those other armed people with one firearm. Okay, that's Custer's last stand.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, in the story, and that's why you can't take that Keith Davis story with any grain of salt whatsoever. And so it's just another one of those situations where none of the stories that are being told make any sense. You
Well,
got
and again,
Davis
you know,
lying.
hearing Death Row Dave. I think it was his recording with Russell when Death Row Dave was saying, "Yeah, we had another meeting at Luxor." Russell was
Yeah.
like, "Jesus, how could have alarm bells not gone off?" And it's like we're a security team. Why would we all of a sudden on fight night, Las Vegas? It just doesn't make sense to ask your
Yeah. He
security
said there
to
were
disarm.
dudes with badges. He said there were dudes with badges being told not to carry any guns that
Right.
they had a license to.
I
Okay.
mean, after what they were planning to do, he had to have known a certain portion of those guys were going to be like, "A, I'm going to carry my weapon," and then after this all
Yes.
plays out, we're going to say in whatever testimony about what happened, yeah, we were told not to carry weapons, which again is a huge. It's circumstantial in of itself, but it's a huge tell of Reggie's kind of motivations. But as we continue, as we wind this one down, as we've heard, you've talked about it. Frank's Alexander, God rest him's talked about it. Jesse, JJ Mix has talked about this. Anybody who is not towing the line is getting these veiled and overt threats. He's talking about
Yep.
Larry C. in a recorded conversation with Frank Alexander. DRR, Death Row Records wants you dead. Jay Mix is talking about getting these veiled threats, having threats of his family, and getting pulled over more. So we see this huge concerted effort against people who are not playing ball, getting threats from
Well, I
well,
don't know if I can. I don't know if I can go into all the details on it, but I can tell you that Jesse's accounting of what happened to him and what surrounded that event about being outed publicly. Um, when you have, the danger is never from the players themselves, as you learned in the case of the murder of John Lennon. It's these people that call themselves fans, that can
mm,
be the most deranged people on the planet. Robert Soria got raped because Tupac fans went in there. I've heard that just recently Keith Davis, Keefy D, was attacked in jail by
heard
a
that.
couple
Yeah,
of Tupac fans. Okay, and he's like, I guess he's okay, and I guess he threw him an ass beating, but he was attacked by fans. Okay, so it's never that when you have a situation where people are outing you publicly and giving away your home address, and you come home and there's somebody in your house.
Jesus, wow.
That's where the rubber meets the fucking road.
Yeah, wow. I
And and
obviously didn't
so
know that.
and so when you see that, and you see recently how Loudmouth gets on the bankrupt Bomb First channel and goes off and says, and is inciting people. No Tupac fan should put up with this. No Tupac fan should do
Right.
this. No Tupac fan. He's inciting people.
Yeah.
He's inciting violence. He's inciting violent behavior. Okay, and thinks he's being slick for doing it. But when those people actually come and things like that happen, it's happened to me. It's happened to Jesse. It's happened to a lot of people that have been involved with this. Okay, I've had the LAPD and the LA sheriffs out to my house many times. Okay. So these are all very real threats that
I
that we
bet.
deal with, something that we deal with. So, but when you don't want to toe that line and you want to tell that narrative, you put yourself right on that radar.
Well, and as they say, when you're getting the most flack, you realize you're over the target, and clearly you've known this for a very, very long time. But
Yep.
again, as we move along, and you mentioned this before, and I thought this was so kind of very poignant. In fact, why now, Las Vegas? What happened? What was the big deal? And clearly, this young man, Andy Donahue, in 2008, he sued Las Vegas 3 times with FOIA requests, trying to get information on the status of the case, and they kept rebutting to him, saying, "No, this is still an ongoing case," which it clearly wasn't. But
Right.
he had a lot of litigation. There was a 2,500 pages in this case. They gave him two. And something I just wanted you to clear up, because in one of the reports in the Las Vegas police report, one of the graphics you showed was something about a stolen white Cadillac that was found. And I didn't know. And then later on, Phil says, well, in the report, we didn't know exactly the make or model. But in this Las Vegas police report, in the 2 pages they gave, was some evidence of a stolen car. I don't know if it was specifically denoted what the make and model was, but there was
Yeah.
some notation of a stolen car. Talk to me a little bit about this Andy Donahue versus Las Vegas and how huge this is to what they're doing now in the arrest of Keefe.
Well, two things happened in 2018 that I think had everything to do with Vegas police getting involved with it, and it's not what they were talking about with the Death Row Chronicles thing. Although I'm sure Reggie Wright was definitely of the know of what was going on at that time. That was also 2018, was I think when Reggie Wright Jr. actually got released from jail when he was out of his federal kick. Um, but in terms of Andy Donahue, he was a guy with the think tank. He was an investigative reporting newspaper and a big. He's like Scripps. They're a big journalism racket. I think he's now in San Diego working for a different outfit. But he wanted to see. He put out some FOIA requests. He wanted to see what was going on with the Tupac case, and Vegas didn't want to give him anything, and he fought him for it, and they had the attorneys get involved, and he had a whole staff of attorneys. Their mistake was thinking this guy didn't have resources, and what they didn't realize is that these guys have between on staff attorneys and attorneys that are very friendly to their cause, journalism and getting information for newspapers. Um, there's a lot of attorneys that can get involved in these things. So Vegas didn't want to give him anything. They go to court. And Vegas loses. Vegas appeals it, but then they give him this 2-page document. It was a report, an incident report filed by Brent Becker, who we all know was one of the lead investigators at the time on the scene during that time. It was filed probably, I want to say, 10 days after the actual events happened. But in this actual incident report, it gives the make, model, and description as a white Cadillac DeVille STS model. And
Found
under
like 2 miles, like a mile and a half from the crime scene, right?
well, no, we'll get there yet. That
Okay, I'm
doesn't
sorry.
it doesn't say that in the incident report.
Okay.
The incident report says that the Cadillac that they listed, the white STS Cadillac DeVille, was stolen locally and recovered locally. Those exact words. And that's why we printed them and we showed them on the screen so there'd be no confusion in anybody's minds what that report said.
Okay.
A police officer made a police report. That is evidence. That is under oath. That is taken to court, ironclad. Okay. You don't make shit up in a police report. I mean, although we know cops do. Um,
Right.
you don't you don't make shit. Technically, you don't make shit up in a police report that's going to discount the credibility of the police report. So, in other words, I'm not going to say that I picked up a car that was stolen locally and recovered locally, and there not ever be a car,
Right.
because there would be no reason for him to put that in the report. He had 10 days to do it. There'd be no reason for him to put that in the report. So I got copies of what Annie Donahue got from Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
I'm
Very
sorry, this went to the Supreme Court as well.
They lost. Yeah, they lost at the Court of Appeals. They fought and fought and fought and fought, and they lost there. And then they went all the way to the Supreme Court in Nevada, fought and fought and fought and fought. Nevada said, nope, you lose. And so they had to give them a certain percentage of it. I think it was probably out of the entire case file. And you got to realize a lot of a case file, especially we saw it with the Biggie case, there's a lot of garbage in there. There's just a lot of just run somebody's DMV, and there's a 5-page printout of a DMV. So a document could be 5 pages. It's one document. And I have a list of every single document that they had up in the file up until that date. So we know what's accounted for and what's not. And we've got pretty much probably 77 to 80% of the entire Vegas police file as of 2018. And that was also too because we were able to fill in a lot of the stuff that Russ Poole had in his files that he got from Vegas PD that were part of the police file there. So between the two, we were actually able to come up with a good thing. But one of the things that was turned over when they did this big batch of documents from the Vegas police to the Center of Investigative Journalism was right behind the page that had that same 2-page document that they gave them. That 2-page document was also included in the big dump of documents that they gave when they lost at the Supreme Court. When they gave them that set of documents, right behind the document page that said that the car was stolen and recovered locally, there is actually a recovered stolen car police report. from a car that was recovered that had been stolen, just as described in the previous incident report, and it was recovered 2 miles from the crime scene. It had been broken into. Many cars that are used in the commission of felonies, especially drive-bys, it's almost gang handbook that the cars are stolen and they commit the crimes in stolen cars. They don't go rent a fucking car at a budget rent-a-car in Compton, use it
Right.
in the commission of the crime, and then turn it in thinking nobody's the wiser, or even dumber, take it to a body shop to get it fixed. Okay. That's all just horseshit. Nevertheless, here in the murder file of Tupac Shakur is this stolen car report. Now, they've redacted out and drew a black line through what the make and model of the car that was recovered in the stolen cover report.
Which is telling in and of itself.
Yes, because they didn't even bother to redact out the name of the victim. Okay. And that's usually number one with a bullet, what you redact out a police report, is the name of the victim. Okay. Whose car it was that was stolen. But this car was stolen, and they took fingerprints from the car, and they took palm prints from the car, and they took hair and fiber samples from this car. They processed the car. They did the job to get the evidence, whatever was in that car. Okay. The doors had been stripped. The engine, the ignition had been stripped. So you could get a screwdriver in there to start the car. All of that's all in there. And again, as the crow flies, it was literally 3 right-hand turns from Flamingo and Koval.
Interesting.
As the crow flies, less than a mile. But they went around because they were seen going down Koval. They made a left, made another left. I said right. I should have said left. They made a left and made another left right into the parking lot there. That parking lot's got a big open parking lot area. Still does to this day. And that was where the stolen car was abandoned there. Okay. Nothing about a magic gun being put on a rear tire at
I was going to ask you that.
at a
That's why I was
casino, at a covered casino parking lot on the strip, which would have had cameras, security cameras, and everything else. No, this was a big, wide, open area parking lot, kind of like you see at a Walmart, just single story. No parking garage, just a big empty lot. And that's where the car was dumped. Now, as Phil Carson said, cars get stolen in Vegas all the time. Okay.
Right.
Why did that one end up in the Tupac Shakur murder file?
Very solid question.
Yeah, well, since Mogg, who is the lead detective, told the grand jury that they never recovered the car. He told them that flat out, never got it. Well, now you're in direct contradiction with what Brett Becker wrote 20 years earlier. So who's lying? Number one. And number two, why would you lie about that and say the car was never gone? Let's pretend that Mogg forgot about the fact that there was the stolen car recovery report, and forget about the fact that Mogg didn't remember that Brett Becker had said the car was stolen and recovered locally. Let's forget those two things for a minute. Why would you say to a grand jury that the car was never been recovered? Because the next thing you're going to ask, that any jury is going to ask, is, well, were Mr. Davis's fingerprints anywhere in the car?
Yes.
No.
Fingerprints, hair fiber, anything. Anything to connect him. Yeah.
Palm prints, anything. And if the answer to that question is no, you've got an uphill battle trying to convince a jury of anything, because they're starting with the fact that, well, if he was in the car, there'd been proof he was in the car.
Right.
And I didn't read anything about the pop-up glove compartment or the pop-up gun compartment in it when they recovered the car. But again, like I said, why would you take the time to document the fact that you processed a stolen car and got evidence and fingerprints and hair analysis out of a stolen car and leave it in a murder file?
Do you know if that particular file will be used by the prosecution, in any way, the defense or the prosecution in Keefe's?
Well, how could it be? How could it be? They've already gone on the record with the grand jury under oath and said that they never found the car.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
How does that work?
Right.
Okay. So you have to say, Lucy, they have some splaining to do.
Yeah.
But
yes.
they do.
Yes.
They do. They've got to deal with a lot of lies that were told at that grand jury testimony. A lot of lies were told. and what I would consider to be provable. I mean, if Tom, Dick, and Harry like me, or a guy like Andy Donahue can go get police reports and police records, and you find in it a police record stamped in red, don't disclose this to anybody, and it says the car was stolen, recovered locally, you've got a credibility problem if your lead detective says it wasn't.
Big
Because
problem.
now you're talking about what else are they lying about, or what else are they wrong about?
Exactly. Well, a good, well-paid attorney, Keefe's attorney, would be able to drill into that, but
Well,
we'll see how it plays out. But here,
Daddy doesn't
Keefe,
have one.
2 months, 2 months after he is search warrant. I'm sorry, no, I'm sorry. Let's 2 months after the search warrant, Keefe D is arrested September 29th, 2023. And here we are as we move into episode 6. But before we, wrap this one up, this is something I think is so hugely important as we move into this case and anything we're talking about. You've talked about it a lot, and as a lawyer in this episode that gets deep into all of this information is based off of fruit from the poisonous tree.
Yep.
So I find it so very difficult, and I'd be anxious to see and fascinated to see how this proceeds with this understanding that so much of this information, if not all of it, is tainted.
It absolutely is. I mean, that's the thing. Between what they can't prove and what they've been able to prove, I mean, they got. I mean, we talked about hearsay, and we talked about this Dirt Rock character who is supposed to be a guy that Keith Davis told that he did it, and that DeAndre Smith, Big Dre, the other guy was in the car, that he told him that he was in the car and that it all happened that way. This Dirt Rock character was actually also an informant for Greg Kading in another case. So, clearly when you start to see about these relationships, and that's what, I hear it said all the time, it's all about the relationships. When you see that these guys were in a stable of, I'll tell you what to say, you say it. That's just the way it is, man. That's the Greg Kading quote. I'll
Well,
tell
this
you.
is the understanding, like you said earlier. Keefe was an informant since obviously pre-Kading era, 1998, but
Yeah.
Keefe also informed on 12 to 15 different of Kading's cases, 12 to 15 different times in some of
Well,
Kading's
we don't know what they were
cases.
talking about, and that's what I want
Of
to make
course.
sure we'll make sure we don't get into too much hot water there, because again, that we don't know what they were talking about. 10 to 12 times they recorded conversation with Keith Davis. I don't think they were talking about the latest football game.
Right,
Okay,
right.
I don't think so. I think what they were talking about, in my opinion, what I believe they were talking about was they were continually sanding, refining, sanding it again, pouring some salve on it, sanding it again, and they kept working the story, working the details. You got a guy like Keith Davis. You ever heard a conversation with Keith Davis? You ever heard an interview with him? I mean, try to look at the interview in Vegas. Try to get this guy to stick to a story. Okay? He can't. So for them to even coach him to the point where he needed to be primetime ready, I think it took all 12 of those interviews just to get the story right,
Mm.
so that he actually understood what the hell the story he was telling really was. Okay.
That's
To
a good
see that.
analogy. I like that. The sanding, yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
it's
very
like,
good.
it's like when
Yeah.
when you get ready to go surfing, and you got to keep applying the wax to the board, and then you sand it down, and then you wax it again, and you sand it down, and you just coat after coat
Yes.
of lacquer on top of it to make sure that whatever story. And then when he finally goes to Vegas, he still can't get the story right. And then when he does the interviews with Vlad, can't get the story right then. Art of Dialogue, can't get the story there right either. Can't get the story right to save his life. So you better be sure it was probably a shit show the first time they ever proposed that Keith Davis endorsed the Orlando Anderson theory.
Yeah, they probably, I don't know, well, like he'd been around a while, but they probably found out later on that they were not exactly dealing with the head of the Mensa organization.
Right, exactly. I mean, yeah, this was definitely not Tolkien, okay,
Yeah.
as far as the
Not
storyteller goes.
not splitting the atoms. Well, again, he has a very uphill battle as we wrap up here, episode 5. We will be jumping into episode 6, dereliction of duty, as we wrap up this series. Any final word for us here, RJ?
No, I'm excited about where the future is heading right now. I can't tell you with specifics, but I can tell you that some components just fell into place last week regarding Keith Davis. some things are falling into place that we had been hoping for weeks that it had been, and maybe it just took time to happen. But some things are developing. If they continue to develop in that track, you may see the trial get pushed back even. Which
Really?
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. They haven't even had an evidentiary hearing yet. They haven't even had a pre-trial hearing, pre-trial evidentiary hearing where they actually have to tell Keith Davis and the defense what evidence they're going to use. They haven't done that. They
Just a
haven't given them that.
full
Yeah.
on shit show. Well, and again, I can't thank you enough for your time. And I'm hoping the function of this breakdown was to, if you haven't seen the series yet, Zumo, Tubi, Tupac cover up, go check it out. And but with these breakdowns, I wanted to dissect and hopefully break down these subjects, this subject that is so dense in the information. So I wind up watching these episodes 3, 4, or 5 times so we can go sequentially through these episodes because there is so much going on. It's like watching Game of Thrones, trying to keep track of all these names, Westboro, I mean, all these different names and families and locations. So I'm
Right.
hoping I'm doing a good job of it, and I hope I'm doing your show justice,
Well, I
RJ.
hope
But
that people, you know what, we got a lot of time right now. It's the first of the year. People are coming up on another weekend coming up. You got plenty of time. A lot of people are off on vacation. It's worth your while to watch the show because not only you get
sure.
entertained, you're going to learn something. And not just that, it may change the way that you feel about what's happening in our legal system right now. So,
Well, I mean, as someone who's been not nearly as deep as you guys, but I've been deep into this for a while, I've obviously learned a lot about this. Honestly, with so many answers, I think I get questions. I think I get answered. I have more questions, but yeah, man, thank you again. Again, we will be back with you very, very soon with episode 6 as we wind down this Tupac cover up breakdown series and episode 6, dereliction of duty. I can't thank you all enough for your time. Happy New Year, peace and so much love. Embrace
happy
all of your
there.
blessings, ladies and gentlemen. We will see you again. Peace and so much love. Stay tuned. There will always be more.
And we're out.
Nice. Yeah, there's a lot went on this one. That Andy Donahue, that's something I had no clue of.